All right, time to go teach. Hello and welcome to this next episode of Tutors, where we are continuing our unit on genetics, and today we are going to be looking at pedigrees and identifying how we are able to track traits through generations. Targets of the day. First target is very simple. It is to identify common symbols that are used in pedigrees. And then we're going to analyze the inheritance patterns and see if we can identify what type of trait is being shown in a specific pedigree. And that is what we're going to be looking at today. So without further ado, here we go. Common symbols that we happen to see. A square, that represents a male. A circle, that is used to represent a female. And if for whatever reason we don't know what the actual biological sex of the individual is, then we use a diamond shape because that individual will be unknown. So if this happens to be a cousin that you just don't happen to know if it was a male or a female, then that is why you'd write down unknown. If you happen to have a line in between a male and a female, that means that they are a mating pair, that they are going to be able to produce offspring. If there is a double line between them, that means that it is a consanguinous mating pair. We see this commonly in royal pedigrees, where there was a lot of mating within the families to maintain the royal lineage within that family unit. If you see a line coming down and then branching out, this would represent the offspring of this pair up top. So these parents happen to have 4 offspring. The offspring are typically written by order of age. The oldest would be on the far left and the youngest would be on the far right. If instead of having just straight lines down, we happen to have an angle like this, this would be dizygotic twins. In other words, fraternal twins. Twins that are as similar to each other as siblings, except they were just born extremely close together. If instead of having dizygotic twins, but we ended up with dizygotic triplets, we would take another line from this same point and have another offspring off of that, either represented with a square for a male or a circle for a female. Monozygotic twins, we draw a line right in between to identify that those twins came from the exact same zygote, that they are identical twins. But back to our original pedigree that showed 1 offspring at a time, no twins in this set. The way that we identify generations is with the Roman numeral across from our different generations. So this is the Roman numeral 1 for our parental generation and Roman numeral 2 for their offspring, the second generation. We also identify the individuals using our Arabic numbers, going just from the left to the right, and this is how we can identify the different individuals. The male parent here would be identified as individual 1, 1. The female parent would be individual 1, 2. And we could do this on the lower end as well, where all of these individuals could be identified by the Roman numeral first and then whatever Arabic number designation there is next to them. And that is the way that we would identify each of our different individuals. If we have an individual shaded in, that means they exhibit or express the trait that is being studied. The trait isn't necessarily dominant or recessive or anything. All we know is that that individual that is shaded in is expressing that particular trait. When we analyze our pedigrees then, we are first going to have to identify what is that trait that we want to study. What is it that's going on? Next, does the trait occur more often in males than it occurs in females? If it occurs more often in males, we would anticipate that that means that that trait is a sex-linked trait. If it occurs in about equal proportions between male and female, then we would think that it is an autosomal trait. And then, does this trait end up skipping a generation? If the trait skips a generation, that means it must be a recessive trait. If it doesn't skip a generation, then it's probably a dominant trait, but not necessarily. It depends on how much information we have. Let's look at a few pedigrees and see what type of trait is being shown. Inheritance pattern number 1. For this pedigree, is it a sex-linked trait? Is it autosomal? Is it dominant or is it recessive? I'll tell you the answer in just a few seconds. All right, so for this specific pedigree, we would anticipate that it's probably X-linked recessive. Now, the reason that this is probably X-linked recessive, first off, we do recognize it would have to be a recessive trait because it does indeed skip a generation. It does not show up in any individual in generation 2, but it does show up in this individual of generation 3. Because individual 3-2 shows the trait, that means it must be a recessive trait. Why do we think it might be X-linked and not autosomal? Well, we can't say this for certain. This pedigree isn't large enough to exactly rule out autosomal inheritance, but it's probably X-linked because this parent right here, the individual 1-1, the male parent would have had to pass on their X chromosome to their female offspring. And that means that the females could be heterozygous, and in this case, would have been heterozygous because they are not actually showing the trait, and we know the trait to be recessive. And we also see that only the male offspring received this trait. So it's probably, that's what would lead us to think that it's X-linked. But this is such a small pedigree that we can't totally rule out that it could be autosomal. There are only 3 individuals in this 3rd generation, and that's not nearly enough information to totally rule out autosomal inheritance. But because it only appeared in males, that would probably lead us to think this could be X-linked. But if you did say autosomal recessive, you might be right. We need more information for this actual pedigree. Let's do another one. Identify the inheritance for this one. In this, we have it showing up in individual 1-2 and in individual 3-2. What type of inheritance pattern is this? Is it X-linked or is it autosomal? Is it dominant or is it recessive? I'll tell you in just a minute. All right, so if you figured out that this happens to be an autosomal recessive trait, you are correct. And because individual 3-2 is expressing this trait, we know that individuals 2-1 and individuals 2-2 must be carrying that trait. And to show that they're carrying the trait, we half fill in the box to show that they are carriers, that they don't express it, but that they do have that allele. In other words, that they are heterozygous for that trait. Why would this have had to have been autosomal recessive? Well, first, recognizing that generation 2, again, didn't show any individuals with that particular trait. And that means it must be recessive. Second thing that we know is that individual 1-2, the female parent, expressed the trait and thus must have been homozygous recessive for that particular trait. But if it was sex-linked, that means her male offspring would have had to express the trait, and they don't. Individuals 2-2 and 2-5 don't express the trait, so it couldn't be X-linked. But we know that individual 2-2 must have been heterozygous because they would have gotten the recessive allele from their parent, which they then passed on to their offspring. And that's why, actually, all of the individuals in the 2nd generation are going to be half filled in because they all must be heterozygous. Either getting the allele from individual 1-2, which would be all of her offspring, or we know that individual 2-1 must be heterozygous because her offspring, individual 3-2, had the trait, and thus had to receive the recessive allele from both parents. Let's do one more, where we're going to identify what is this inheritance pattern. I will tell you the answer in just a second. All right, this would be autosomal dominant. And the reason why is because it doesn't skip a generation. It shows up in these different generations, generation 1, 2, and 3. But also, what we can see is that the non-filled in individuals do skip a generation, where these parents 2-1 and 2-2, they neither one show the non-shaded in trait, but they have offspring that do show the non-shaded in trait. And because the non-shaded in trait skips a generation, we know that it must be recessive, and thus the shaded in trait must be dominant. That's how that can work out. So don't always just look at the shaded in. You can also look at the non-shaded, and that can reveal a whole lot of information. We would guess that this is probably autosomal because it shows up about equally in our different sexes, 2 females and 2 males. So because we see about the same amounts in the biological sexes, we would think this is mostly autosomal. So in summary of all this, pedigrees, they are going to be useful for us as we are going to be tracking a trait through an actual family. They are going to allow us to then determine a little bit of information about that trait. Is that trait probably sex-linked, or is it probably autosomal? Is that trait probably dominant, or is that trait probably recessive? The larger the pedigree, the more information that is provided, and thus the more information that we can say about that specific trait. It also would reveal to us what are the chances that an individual may be a carrier of a specific trait or not. And that is why many genetic counselors use pedigrees to determine what the chance is that a couple could pass on a specific trait, typically of some sort of genetic disease. And that is pedigrees. Until next time, be awesome, stay awesome.